Hello, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this webinar session, the third in our Curious in a Crisis series. We're just going to wait a few moments to make sure that everyone has joined us from the waiting room. But in the first instance, could we just draw your attention to, hopefully you can see the slide on your screen at the moment that's just pinpointing you to keep your microphones and your videos turned off, please, in the first instance. And we're doing this to minimise any kind of technical disruption during the session. And also just to let you know that we're actually recording today's webinar. So that's why we're asking everyone to turn the videos off so we don't experience any kind of issues there. And at the end of the webinars, we will be putting all of the recordings up on the Curious Minds website so you can all have access to sessions once the series has finished. We've got lots of people joining us today, so please feel free to introduce yourself, say hello using the chat box, tell us a bit about who you are and where you're from and what you do. It'd be lovely to hear from you. Looks like we're just there's a few more people joining us, so welcome everybody who's joining us on the webinar. And it looks like we've got most people with us now, so I think we'll make a start for today's session. So as I say, hello, welcome. We're absolutely delighted that you are joining us at this session with us today. And hopefully what you'll be expecting to experience on today's webinar is a session that's focusing on an introduction to safeguarding online for you. If I've not had the pleasure of meeting you before today, just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Hannah Lambert and I work as the Programmes Coordinator here at Curious Minds. And I can see we've got a lot of familiar faces with us on today's session. But if there's we do have a few people who are joining today who this may be the first time that you're engaging with us here at Curious Minds. So in the first instance, I'd just like to tell you a bit about who we are and what we do as an organisation. So Curious Minds, we are what is known as a sector support organisation or a bridge organisation. And we are basically an arts charity. We are situated in the Northwest and we serve the whole of the Northwest region. And we basically exist to ensure that children and young people across the Northwest have access to high quality arts and cultural education, experiences and opportunities. Now, we do this in a number of different ways, but one of the main ways that we do this is that we work with the education sector and we work with the arts and cultural sector. And one of the things that we try to do as a bridge organisation is bridge that gap between the two sectors and get them talking to each other, working with each other, forming strategic partnerships and relationships, all with this end idea of making sure that children across the Northwest have access to great and high quality arts and cultural provision. So you may have guessed from what I've just been saying that actually the main body of our work is not actually direct delivery with children and young people, but we are here as a sector support organisation to support you as the professionals who do provide direct delivery with those children and young people. So most of our work takes the form through events and training. We've also got leadership programmes as well. And moving nicely on into the Curious in a Crisis programme, that is part of our work that we have developed in response to the ongoing pandemic situation that we've all kind of found ourselves in these past few challenging and very difficult months. So just to give you a bit of an idea about our Curious in a Crisis programme. So as I say, here at Curious Minds, we developed it in a response to the ongoing pandemic. And we've kind of launched two strands so far of the programme. The first is a bursary scheme that we have created. Some of you on the session this afternoon have benefited directly from that bursary scheme. And that was where we provided recipients small bursaries to help you, I should say, kind of cushion that initial shockwave of the outbreak as it happened in March. So just to get you through that initial impact as the situation kind of developed there. But in tandem with those bursaries that we provided for professionals across the arts and cultural sector, we've also developed this series of webinars to kind of support you during this ever-changing, ever-evolving new world that we kind of find ourselves in, with those kind of different and difficult kind of challenges as we try to navigate ourselves in the coming weeks and months. So, as I say, today's session is going to be focusing on an introduction to safeguarding online. And similarly to the rest of the webinar sessions that we've been hosting, the content of today's session has been decided upon from some consultation that we did with freelancers and small arts and cultural organisations to find out what you most needed to know about during these next weeks and months. So as I say, it's an introduction to safeguarding online and very much a beginner's kind of introduction to this particular topic. The webinars in general have been designed with that kind of beginner's guide in mind, and a number of our kind of sessions have been led by furloughed volunteers. However, today's session has been specifically commissioned by our friends and experts at TIP, because we know they have extensive experience within this region. So I'll be shortly introducing our guest speaker, who is Simon Ruding, in a moment. But firstly, I'd just like to take this opportunity just to quickly go through the timings and the logistics of today's session for you. So we're going to be here until 6 o'clock today. And as I say, in a moment, we'll shortly hand over to Simon, and he's going to take us through the kind of main section of today's session, which will last for about 35 minutes or so. And during that time, please feel free, if any questions crop up as Simon's working through the content of the session, feel free to pop those questions down in the chat box. As a member of the Curious Minds team, we'll be monitoring these, and what we're going to try and do is collate as many as possible and put them to Simon at the end of the session. So we do have some allocated Q&A time with Simon towards the end of the session. Unfortunately, because of some time constraints, we've only got about 5 minutes during the main part of the session for Q&A. However, we've listened to some feedback from our previous webinars, and some of the guests said that they would really love a bit more Q&A time in these webinars. So as I say, unfortunately, we can't do it in the main part of the session. But what Simon has kindly agreed to do is just hang on at the end at 6 o'clock. So if any of you do have any burning questions that we've not managed to get around to, please feel free to stay online and you can ask Simon your question directly at the end. As I say, we'll finish the session at 6 o'clock, so please feel free to kind of say goodbye to us then if you're all done and dusted. But if you do have any questions, you're also more than welcome to stay online at the end as well. So as I say, a bit of time for Q&A, but just before we wrap up at the end of the session, we're also aware that, you know, we've got a great number of participants into today's session. But unfortunately, because of the way these webinars kind of run, there's not much opportunity for interaction between yourselves. So we just wanted to give you the opportunity right at the end of the session just to say a quick hello to each other. So what we're going to do is pop you into some breakout rooms, and you'll have about 5 minutes or so just to kind of introduce yourselves and talk a bit about who you are and what you do. So that's kind of, I think, everything that I need to get through in this first part here. So I'd now like to take the opportunity to welcome and introduce our guest speaker for today. So hello, Simon. Thank you very much for joining us. And obviously we work with you a lot in the past and obviously in the present, but for the benefit of those guests who may not have worked with you before or know too much about who you are you happy just to kind of introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about who you are and who TIP are and what you do?
Absolutely. So I'm Simon Ruding. I'm director of TIP. TIP is a small-scale, independent, participatory arts organisation based in Manchester, actually based in the University of Manchester. And we particularly specialise in working within justice settings. So that may see us working in prisons, but it also sees us working in youth justice and broader social justice contexts. And that led us around about 15, maybe even 20 years ago now, to start to develop a bit of a specialism in safeguarding and child and vulnerable adult protection practices in participatory arts, and for the longest period of time, Arts Council has had us as a keeping arts advisor organisation, and it's in that capacity, I guess, that I'm here today with you guys.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So as you can see, we've absolutely called on the right people to deliver today's session. And something that did just occur to me, so for those of us who may not be aware, TIP is actually an acronym, isn't it? So
yes.
Do you mind
yes,
just explaining?
It's an acronym that we for a much longer name, which is the Theatre in Prisons and Probation Research and Development Centre. But because we work in much more than theatre and in contexts much broader than prisons and probation, we only really use the acronym now and just call ourselves TIP.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Well then, Simon, that's a fantastic introduction there. So over to you then for the main part of the session.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I'm going to be playing with a new piece of software today, so all being well, it will work brilliantly. I'm going to be using a piece of software called Prezi Videos. I'm not on any commission, but it does work very well. I've got a short amount of time to get through quite a chunk of material, so please do write your questions down and I'll hopefully get to them at the end of the session. What I should also say is, and I'll repeat this at the end, with some of our Arts Council funding monies, I'm also available to do calls, one-to-one consultations, respond to emails, all that kind of stuff after this meeting. And that's part of the deal with both Curious Minds and with Arts Council. So please do feel free to get in touch if you can't hang around at the end of the session. A quick acknowledgement about this session. In the second part of this, the session is broken to 3 in parts. In the second part of the session, I'll be talking through some of the causes of concern, some of the areas of worry around safeguarding, which means I may be referencing material which could raise personal concerns or indeed have personal resonances for people. If it does, feel free to leave the session. I will say when I'll be talking about those things. I'm not going into any great deal of detail, but I know that some subject matter can be sensitive for people. If it does have a resonance for you, please do share your concerns with somebody. And if you don't have anyone to talk to, I'd encourage you to get in touch with NSPCC or Childline or something like that. And on the final slide, there's a lot of contact details you can, with the numbers that you can get in touch with those organisations. Okay, so the learning outcomes today, I've only got a short amount of time, so I've only got one learning outcome. I just want you to have a better insight into safer online practice and have an idea of where to go to if you have any questions or need further advice and guidance. And nothing too complicated there at all. The presentation is split into 3 parts. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to the safeguarding terminology. It's probably a refresher for a lot of you, but it does make sure that we're speaking the same language. If you have heard me talk before, I apologise. You're going to hear me talk through some of the same definitions again, but like I say, it makes sure we're all on the same page. The second section looks at some of the areas of concern, outlining some of the concerns for safeguarding and for welfare in the online environment. And then in the third and final section will be an introduction to good practice protocols. And they're gathered and garnered from a range of sources and practitioners, from teachers, from artists, from the NSPCC, Department of Education, organisations and agencies like the Incorporated Society of Musicians, to name but a few. And these are all acknowledged in the accompanying handout that you'll get a copy of, and I've provided links to various organisations and agencies should you wish to read more. And I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. back to me very briefly. So, introduction. This first bit, I'm going to just introduce you to the whole idea of safeguarding and safeguarding terminology as a frame of reference. Like I say, you may have heard it before, it may be familiar, but let's just make sure we're all talking the same language. So, 2 quick questions. Just to ask yourself, I'll give you 13 seconds. 13 seconds to answer the question in your head. What is safeguarding, and who are we safeguarding, and what are we safeguarding them from? They're the things I'm going to be touching upon in the section that we're about to go into. Don't have any time to do this as a full exercise. Normally, if I was working in a group, I would get everybody to have a conversation. We'd have that space here, but these are the questions that I'd like to start off with. Safeguarding, a definition. This is, I think, taken, if I remember rightly, I took it from the online Oxford Dictionary. Really like it. I like it because it talks about notions of protection from harm and appropriate measures. So anything that we do which is preventing somebody from being harmed is a safeguard. I also like it because it has this phrase, a framework which safeguards employees from exploitation. And that reminds me to remind you that a good safeguarding approach not only safeguards the people we're working with, but it safeguards us and it safeguards the organisations and agencies that we work for. So it's got a broad application, the safeguarding agenda. It isn't just about the child protection element. However, we're here with curious minds and they work with children, as Hannah described earlier on. So we are specifically focusing today on the principles and how online safeguarding applies to children. So let's just quickly define what a child is in law. A child is anyone who is not in their 18th birthday. And it doesn't matter if they're 16, it doesn't matter if they're in the army, it doesn't matter if they're in custody or in hospital, it doesn't matter whatsoever. They're still entitled to all the legal protections that all children are entitled to. Now, I'll be honest, I tend to use the phrase, as I think most people do, child and children and young people interchangeably. But in this context, when I'm talking about children and young people, I'm talking about under 18-year-olds. So when I make reference to law or any legal things as we work through, I'm talking to the law or about the law as it relates to people under the age of 18. When you hit your 18th birthday, you magically transform in the eyes of the law, and a whole new set of protections and legislation applies to you. We're talking about under 18-year-olds today. I do a thing entirely about vulnerable adults, and if you're interested, you can get in touch. Okay, some facts and figures. Oh, sorry, no, some principles, first of all. Some principles of safer working, which are kind of fairly critical and underpin my approach and the work that we do in safeguarding. We drew these from different sectors. We actually got them from the health sector, the early years sector, and from education, and from child protection sector as well. And combined, they act as a really good set of guiding principles for practice. If you want to just remember one as the critical one, it's the one in the green box there, top right, that we should need to work in an open and transparent way. Because I think that's particularly apposite and important in the context of digital practice, given that it can be exchange which happens in a private environment. This notion that we work in openness and transparency as much as possible. And I will be coming back to that later when we look at good practice. And the other two principles there in the purple, I don't know, ready, brownie box, whatever, I don't know what that is, visual arts would have to tell me. The other two remind us that we have a responsibility for each other and to keep each other safe, that we should always behave in a way which is not open to misinterpretation, and that we need to be watching ourselves at all times and being aware of how actions and words can be misunderstood. And I think, again, that's particularly highlighted in the digital environment. Back to me briefly. I'm getting used to this software, I think. I'm quite liking it. Some quick facts and figures. So this is the final slide of this section. And it's an interesting set of figures that comes from an Ofcom report of 2 years ago. Now, I'll offer a few caveats on this shortly, but it's worthwhile, I think, sort of setting a broader context. It's 2 years old, this, so I think we can imagine that probably some of the facts and figures and statistics have increased over that period of time. But it's also a limited piece of research. I know certainly there's a substantial amount of young people that we work with who face a whole range of different forms of digital exclusion. Interestingly, one of the key manifestations of digital exclusion isn't necessarily absence of getting hold of equipment. It's actually getting access to the internet. So people are excluded from data, or they're excluded because they can't afford the data, or they have poor access to broadband, or the kit is shared amongst several members of a family. What I think, regardless of that, this data tells us, this information, this research tells us, is that we're living in a world of digital natives, young people who have grown up in the world of tech in a way that me in my mid-50s didn't. When I was 15, all we had in our house was a single phone and one colour telly and one black and white telly and 3 television channels. And I think, I kind of think it would have been lockdown would have been a very, very different experience in that. My daughter now, who's a child, 16, she has managed to survive lockdown quite simply by spending an awful lot of time online talking. She's maintained social contact at a distance in a way that we wouldn't have been able to 30 years ago. But as much as that is a brilliant privilege, it also brings with it a whole host of risks and a whole host of new risks, which is what we're going to move on to consider in the next section. So, areas of concern. What is it we're actually worried about? What is it that could be causes of concern? What is it that the NSPCC and various organisations and agencies that work with children and work with online risk are worried about? This, by the way, is the section where I may reference some material that some of you may find distressing, so please feel free to be signed off for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, or to leave the session if you're in any way concerned. But like I said earlier on, please do have a reference point, talk to somebody. Okay. I'm going to introduce you to a really simple model. The 3 C's. I think they were first defined by the NSPCC, and they're an ideal filter for us to consider the risks of any online project that we may be designing or considering. I'm going to go into detail with each one of these C's so you get a sense of what the concerns are. So it's actually 4 C's. It's concerns about contact, concerns about conduct. What is it specifically that these 3 C's refer to in the digital environment? The first one, content. So here, with content, you need to think of children, young people, as being the recipients of material that is inappropriate in some way, shape, or form. Maybe age inappropriate. It's not necessarily illegal, but it could be significantly age inappropriate. So it could even be mass distributed content, stuff which we wouldn't know how to find online easily enough. It may expose them to material that, such as pornography, extreme violence, or content which involves speech or radicalization elements. Equally, in terms of sort of bias or what they call extreme opinion, it could be sites that promote self-harm or encourage eating disorders or are pro-suicide. So it's stuff which is available out there, not being pushed necessarily at anybody. It's where the child, a young person, can access it as a recipient. It's mass distributed material, if you like, mass distributed content. So that's one of the areas of concern, is to protect children and young people from that material. The second C is contact. So here, if you like, there's a shift. The child, the young person, is a participant in something. They are being contacted. There is an exchange taking place in some way, shape or form. So children are as participants in interactive situations. So this can involve being bullied. It could be child being a victim of harassment or being stalked in some way, meeting strangers, having conversations with people that lead to inappropriate exchanges, threats to privacy, simple, straightforward threats to privacy, identity, and reputation. What do I mean by reputation? Well, things like embarrassing photographs being shared without permission, or in terms of identity, a house location or address being identified and being shared, or indeed someone impersonating a user or impersonating a child. Users sharing information with strangers, children sharing information with strangers who are hiding behind another identity. It might involve threats of violence. It might involve abuse directly aimed at individual children or groups of children. So this is where contact is taking place. It not necessarily is happening through things like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. It's much more potentially platforms such as Facebook, or that's probably, actually, my son tells me at 20 he is at the youngest sort of edge of young people using Facebook. So other services such as Instagram or Snapchat being used in this way. And finally, there in the square, the shape at the bottom right, we're looking at the idea of grooming. So grooming is dependent upon contact, and it's grooming of children to get them to participate in illegal activity. It could be illegal criminal activity, so children being criminally exploited, or it could be children being exploited in a sexual way. Everything from getting them to share images right across to actually creating opportunities to meet in person. So that's a second area of concern. How do we protect children and young people or mitigate the risks of contact? The third C is conduct. Here, this is, if you like, we've considered the child as the recipient of material in content. We've considered the child as a participant in something, exchanging information, getting involved in conversation. Here, this is where the child is the actor in the activity, in the abuse, in the abusive behaviour, and it could be a young person leading or taking part in bullying or harassing behaviour, being aggressive or stalking other young people. It could be sending inappropriate material, sexting, inappropriate messages. The young person, the child themselves, taking on the persona of somebody else to distribute inappropriate material about them or create create rumours. Equally, it could be the promotion of harmful behaviours such as self-harm, suicide, anorexia, bulimia, or promoting illegal drug use, or the imitation of dangerous behaviour, planking on the top of cranes that are over Manchester city centre, for example, encouraging children and young people to engage in those sorts of behaviours. But we should also acknowledge here that a child or a young person's own conduct online can also make them vulnerable. So, for example, by the oversharing of personal information, or by getting involved in leading harassment and bullying, that also makes them vulnerable in a sense themselves. It is also about being conscious of youth-produced sexual imagery. Typically the nude selfie, and there's an extraordinary and really fascinating body of information for parents and carers on the NSPCC website about nude selfies and the inappropriate sharing of sexual imagery, because there's a heck of a lot of research which has gone into it in terms of why children and young people do it. There's also here risks of children and young people being drawn into online gambling, or using false age identification, which is, legally speaking, fraud, to enter into get into websites, or to look at inappropriate material, or simply getting involved with other illegal activities. Hacking, of course, again, is legal. And now what we'll, so this is the third of the 3 C's.
Oh, that's all right.
So what we got here is the 3 C's. So as a simple starting point, when you are designing an online project, you can ask yourself the following question: could the project that you're putting together, because the idea that you're developing, expose children and young people to inappropriate content? Does the project place children and young people at significant contact risk? Or could the project result in young people behaving inappropriately towards each other? And if you can answer yes to any or all of those, then we consider putting safeguarding measures in place to reduce the chances of those things happening. In simple terms, in really, really simple terms, we can use the 3 C's as headings for a risk assessment for a project. Move on to the final section now. Like I say, this is a whirlwind introduction, and what I wanted to do in this third and final section was to really provide a sense of what constitutes good practice in online safeguarding, and I'm particularly concerned to address the growing use of this kind of medium, video conferencing. It's the one that I've seen essentially explode over the past few months as people have been reaching out for ways to maintain contact with project participants, develop new ways of working. And so I'm going to pick up a lot in this next section, specifically good practice in this kind of environment. Now, I'll mostly be referring to Zoom because that is the most ubiquitous, but I know other software platforms are available, and I'm trusting that if you're familiar with those platforms, then you'll be able to take the underlying principle that I'm talking about and adapt it to your preferred software. If not, give us a shout after the session and we can arrange to have a natter and a chat if there are any other concerns. The first thing I'll just share with you, I've stolen this from the UK Council for Internet Safety. I love it because it's simple. it basically offers the pithiest and most straightforward safe practice guidance that I've come across. It is what it says on the tin. If it's unacceptable offline, then it's unacceptable online. So that's a really good principle of good practice to underpin good practice and safeguards. So, good practice in planning an online project. Talked about the 3 C's already. Good practice is having a separate Zoom, Skype, Facebook account, whatever online account for your online sessions. So you are clear and you have clear communication channels. The principle here is about making sure your relationship with your participants remains professional, so that nothing is misconstrued or misinterpreted. Remember the second of the 3 principles: do stuff which don't do things which could be misinterpreted. So this would apply to offline as well as online interaction. You know, we don't give out personal telephone numbers. We avoid giving personal email accounts from Facebook and other social media links. It's about a professional relationship. Transparency in all dealings. The second point here, keeping parents and carers informed as much as possible, picks up on this notion of transparency. Put the effort in to ensure that parents and carers are informed and give consent where necessary, as much in exactly the same way as we would do if this were in the real world. This is particularly important if you're using images, recordings, etc., where you're going to need parental permissions to use photographs. Do all you possibly can to share what it is you're planning to do and how you're planning to go about it. Stay open, stay completely transparent. And again, this third point here is largely to do with transparency again. This comes from music practice, actually. The idea that we use parents' accounts or carers' accounts to talk with or communicate with the children and young people that we're working with. Now, I know that some young people, particularly older ones, I'm thinking about this with my daughter here, they would not want to take this approach, but simply making the request serves to safeguard you, keeps you safe. It may also be that the young person, just bear in mind, it may also be that the young person refusing to share parental details may be a cause for concern in and of its own right. So you may want to be making a mental note of that. There may be other safeguarding concerns there. A clear written policy about what you do online. Well, that kind of makes sense. I think the best policies are no more than one side of A4, and they just lay out the rules of engagement and the rules of engagement that you'll follow. Doesn't have to be complicated, but it should incorporate the items in these lists and offer a contact number or address for the young person to get in touch with if they have worries or concerns. So not your contact number or address, somebody else that they can talk to if they have concerns in any exchanges they've had with you or with another young person in an online group that they don't feel they can bring to you. Again, pretty standard stuff that we would do in any group working context. Getting the written agreement, getting this agreement to parents and carers again. This again is about transparency. If we're going to be doing work which is involving the photographs and images, for example, we would have to be getting their permissions anyway. And this is again very much about safeguarding you. This can get slightly complicated if you're working for an organisation or venue, right? Because what I've noticed over recent months, certainly since the lockdown, where I've been doing consultation with individual artists, is that they may be working for organisations that don't have these policies in place because the organisations or the venues that they're working for have yet to catch up in terms of putting together an online policy and policy approach. So it might be that you as the freelance practitioner are actually informing the venue, the commissioning local authority, what good practice is here. Finally here, don't forget that if you're taking people's email addresses and you're taking contact details off them and names, you've got legal responsibilities under the data protection regulations, the GDPR. And it really, I know it's dull as ditch water, but it is worth familiarising yourself with the legislation as a matter of course. And I've provided a link to that in the information about that in the handout. The data protection regulations apply to sole traders, small organisations and freelancers as much as it do to bigger companies. So again, that's about safeguarding yourself. Make sure you know what you can and can't do with the information that you're getting. And how long you can keep it for example, and what you need to tell parents and carers. Good practice in delivering online stuff. Oh, wrong button. I apologise. Here we go. There we go. It wouldn't be right and proper if I didn't press the wrong button at least once. Good practice in delivering online sessions means, shouldn't it really need to be said, the first one, but make sure you present yourself professionally and consider you as a representative of the participatory arts sector. Really do think about your backdrop to your activities. I mean, Hannah's got a great backdrop. There's Curious Minds screen behind her there. Having stuff like that makes sure that you're retaining a kind of professional demeanour in the way that you present yourself. We ask this of the young people, you know, so we absolutely should be avoiding broadcasting from our bedrooms is what I think I'm saying here. You know, think carefully, think about this, where you're broadcasting from. Second point here, which links to the young people, transparency principle in practice is particularly important in one-to-one work, and it safeguards you and it safeguards the young people. So in a room with an open door as much as possible. Agree a code of conduct with the young people. At a minimum, agreed how they will behave towards each other, how you expect them to be dressed, so not in pyjamas, for example, and agree what will be the best place for them to be talking to you from in the home. And again, ideally not from their bedroom if they can avoid it, but sometimes that can't be avoided because of the nature of the spaces that we're in. But the same rules apply to you as apply to the group, so think about it in that way. In terms of, just quickly, a quick note about recording sessions here. It's a tricky one and requires a further level of agreement. You shouldn't record a session without the knowledge and written consent of the young people and their parents and guardians. So if you do want to record sessions, get consent in writing before you make a recording, have a written policy, remember it's GDPR related, and if you do record, make sure you film in a neutral area where nothing personal or inappropriate can be seen or heard in your background or their background. And then let's quickly move on to the next. I'm conscious of time. Practice session delivery again. Doing what Curious Minds have done here, keep everyone in the waiting room until the session starts so that you're controlling the space. It means you avoid being placed in one-to-one exchanges with a young person. It ensures equitability, make sure everyone, your interactions with everyone are clear and transparent and understood. This is what we're talking about groups here, obviously. Letting everyone know what you'll do if the session is bombed in some way, shape or form. There's a lot of horror stories out there about how Zoom calls have been Zoom bombed and inappropriate materials been posted into the middle of meetings. Set up some protocols for what you'll do if this will happen. Typically, you end the session immediately. You start after 15 minutes with a new invite and password. And this also is a useful protocol to employ if one of your participants starts to behave inappropriately or posts inappropriate material as well in the session. Being conscious of the environment, you'll be provided with an invitation into a young person's home, as much as you're inviting them to yours or your space, which may mean that you witness interactions and gain insights into their home life. If anything concerns you, anything happens that makes you worry, make a note of it and pass it on to your commissioning organisation's designated person, to your line manager, or if you're working on your own project, have a conversation with social care or the NSPCC. General advice. Repeat what I've said earlier on. Be open, be transparent, a policy of no secrets. Report nagging doubts. If anything has you concerned, pass it on to someone, have a conversation with someone, no matter how embarrassing it may seem. Always ask yourself, in terms of the material that you're putting together, the project that you're putting together, can I justify what I'm doing? Could I be misinterpreted here in some way, shape or form? If you're working for an organisation or an agency, a local authority, make sure you're clear on what their policies and procedures are. I think sometimes that is a kind of fairly critical one. Well, often that's a fairly critical one, particularly because it may mean that what you're doing is informing them about decent online practice. And check that the organisation permits you to use your preferred social media or conferencing platform. Don't assume. I've been doing some consultation of late with a group who are working for museums, and museums are working with their own policies, which are based on local authority policies. So there's 3 sets of policies in place, and there can be conflicts. Make sure you're very, very clear on what they all are and whose rules you're working to. Doctor, the end. I hope I've gone over by a couple of minutes there, Hannah. I hope you don't mind.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for that, Simon. I was sorry, I was a bit delayed there because I was actually scribbling down some of what you were saying, because it's just I think we can all agree that, you know, you provided a lot of food for thought, I should say, there on that huge topic of online safeguarding. Thank you again so much for leading this session for us. I think it's been absolutely invaluable. And as we said right at the start, we will upload this session onto the Curious Minds website, because we are aware there's a lot of information within Simon's presentation this afternoon. So you can always revisit this webinar at a later stage as and when you wish to do so. And I think, Simon, you said you're happy to share a few accompanying resources as well. Was that, did you say?
Yeah, I think I sent a handout as well, which I think has a lot of handy organisations and reference points in it, and notes, and you can feel free to circulate that to everyone as well, Hannah.
Lovely, thank you so much. So we'll share those with you as well. We'll probably stick them up on the Curious Minds website for you to have access to them there. So as I say, thank you so much again. We have had some questions coming through, and if you're happy to, before we send everyone off into their breakout rooms, we'll just pose a few of those questions for you now, if that's okay. So the first question I have has come through Linda, and she's asked if you are aware of any changes that are being made specifically by Zoom to guard against the Zoom bombing issue that you've mentioned there.
Made by Zoom?
Yeah, or
yeah, I mean,
I think Zoom, Linda asked about.
It's interesting. The Zoom, the majority of Zoom bombing cases that I've come across have occurred because of low levels of security on the host side. So things like not having a password in place, or widely circulating the contact details, or the link rather, on open social media like Facebook or through Twitter. So people, for a laugh, have bombed in and sabotaged those particular meetings. I'd just say make sure if you are going to use Zoom or any of the other platforms, password protect them so that people can't get in. People still do, which is why I recommend having those protocols in place for quickly closing everything down and then restarting the meeting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And because we've been very kind of, as everyone else, been on that steep learning curve with Zoom over the past few months, and we've been trying everything we can do from Curious Minds perspective to kind of make sure we're as safe and protected as possible. The other thing we have been trialing with some of our sessions is there is actually a function on Zoom where you can lock the meeting. So once you've got everyone in, you can actually switch on lock, and it just means nobody can enter the meeting then or Zoom bomb you. And the other thing which everyone might have experienced today is being part of that waiting room. So you as the host, as you say, Simon, it's that thing is having the control as the host, trying to put those things in place as much as possible. So obviously with the waiting room, as Curious Minds, we're seeing who's in the waiting room, and we admit as and when you know, we see people who have booked onto the session. And the next question, I should say, that we've had come in is actually from Holly, and she's asking, what approach should freelancers take if their online safeguarding is ahead of any venues or organisations they are working with? So should they work with them?
It's a really good question, Holly. It's a really good question. I think it utterly depends upon who the organisation is that you're working with. I would always say that if you're working to a higher level of safety and security, stick with your policies and protocols. Where the conflicts have happened is where local authorities have been funding projects and have then prescribed certain software. So, for example, some local authorities will not let anybody working for the local authority or on behalf of the local authority use Zoom, which became a really big problem for one of the projects I've been working with, because it was their preferred software of choice, and other approaches were likely to be more costly. So that's where I think a lot of the conflicts can occur. I would say, Holly, just to go back and gently say, look, have you thought about updating your policy and procedures? Because I kind of think there are these gaps and holes here which need filling. And a failure to safeguard the young people is often also a failure to safeguard you as a practitioner. And it's really in your best interests to, you know, take a reasonable but firm approach with the venue or the organisation to try and get them to shift their position in some way, shape or form.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer to that question. Thank you very much. We have had a few more questions come through the chat. A couple of people who are saying, I've got a fairly specific question, so they're going to hang on right to the end of the session and probably ask you those at 6 o'clock once we've ended the kind of the formal session. So just again, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. It's been absolutely invaluable, the content of this session this afternoon. And so now what
Before I go, just to remind people that some of our Arts Council funding funds us to offer one-to-one support and advice, or to advice and guidance to organisations. So my contact details are there. You'll have them in the handout. If you don't get around to asking your question today, or in, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months time, you find yourself in a situation where you're not quite sure what to do, or there's a question, please do drop me a line and I'll get back in touch with you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okie dokie, so that's the end of the main session today, but as I say, we're just going to, for these last few minutes, give you the opportunity to just say hello to one another. So we've set up some breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do now is click a magic button, which will open all of those breakout rooms. And basically, you need to, what should happen is a window should appear with a little tab that says join. So you need to press that tab that says join. So you go head into that breakout room there. So I'll click that magic button now, and it should appear for you, hopefully. And we'll bring you back together in a moment. Thanks, everyone.